And at this time, I would like to introduce your host for the evening, the commander of Joint Base Myer-Henderson Hall, Colonel Michael Henderson.
Thanks, Lee. I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for coming. But General and Mrs. Risch, General and Mrs. Wilson, community, installation partners, distinguished guests, good evening. On behalf of Joint Base Myer-Henderson Hall and my Command Sergeant Major Randy Woods, I take great pleasure in welcoming all of you to historic Fort McNair and to the equally historic Fort McNair Officers Club, and to this special evening as we observe the 150-year anniversary of the start of the military tribunal of those who conspired to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln in 1865. We are also honored to have with us tonight several authors, historians, and subject matter experts on the topics of the Lincoln Assassination and military tribunal, as well as some direct descendants of those involved with that historic event in our nation's history. Welcome all. And I would like to extend a special thanks to the members of the U.S. Army Band String Quartet who provided the wonderful music during our reception. Let's give those folks a hand. Today is historically significant, as the 9-member military commission first met on this date, May 8th, 1865, and of course the military tribunal began the next day on May 9th. This observance will give us all the opportunity to learn in more detail about and reflect on what happened here 150 years ago. We have an excellent program lined up for you tonight. You will hear from 4 distinguished authors and subject matter experts who will answer many of the questions we all have about what happened and over the 2 months of the trial and the execution that followed. And following their remarks, we'll walk over to Grant Hall to have a look inside the courtroom where the trial took place and visit the execution site. And I hope everyone has a great evening. So to begin our program, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's first speaker, historian and author Michael Kauffman.
Well, thank you so much. As I look up at the screen, it reminded me that whenever I'm invited to speak somewhere, they always say, "Can I get you anything, PowerPoint, anything?" There's one condition that lately has been creeping into my demands, my list of demands. One of them, if you look at this, please do not bring this up to me and say, "Oh my God, when was that picture taken?" We'll all get there sooner or later, you know. I can't believe what we're doing. This is so nice, so wonderful that we are now celebrating the restoration of this courtroom. This is such a valuable and important part of American history, American legal history, Civil War history. I don't think it has really been acknowledged or noticed quite as much as it ought to have been. And I'm so surprised that the restoration was undertaken, and just delighted at the job they've done with it. The reason I think the Lincoln conspiracy trial is so important and should be better known to all people is that it was a military trial of civilians at a time when those things had been sort of commonplace. Most people don't realize that. And when I started to study the trial back in the 1970s, people tended to say, well, what difference does it make for us now? Why do we care now? Because we're never going to have military trials of civilians again. The academic type said, don't waste your time, just go out and study constitutional law, because that touches upon this. Oh, no, okay, it does, sure. But after 9/11, people started calling me and saying, hey, what do you know about this? And amazingly, I found something about this trial that was a little bit, I hate to say uplifting, but it was kind of a positive note. They didn't use this as a precedent. During the American Civil War, military necessity, and let's face it, you can't really say there was no necessity to take extreme measures during the American Civil War. At the very beginning, the first week of the war, Abraham Lincoln, the new president, has learned the hard way that Washington is really surrounded by people who are not terribly friendly to the Union and to his administration. On one side, you've got Virginia, and out the window, Lincoln can see that. Enemy territory, or it would soon be. The other three sides of Washington, well, that's Maryland. And most people don't stop to think about what was going on in Maryland. It was below the Mason-Dixon line, sure, but it stayed in the Union. And that's all anybody really needs to know, right? Not really. Because Abraham Lincoln came through Maryland on the way to become President of the United States in February of 1861. And there were rumors that somebody was going to kill him on the way through Baltimore. It was perfectly believable, and as I found out very much to my surprise, when James Buchanan came through through Baltimore on his way to become president, they beat him up. And Buchanan was kind of inoffensive at the time, you know. So when Lincoln comes through, the idea that somebody would try to kill him was quite believable, and of course he had to take precautions. He took an earlier train, he came through Washington in the middle of the night, and it made him look foolish. And he got a very valuable lesson from that. He learned that Baltimore is going to come back and bite you sooner or later. And so he declared martial law first along what is now called the I-95 corridor, and then all over the state of Maryland, because a week after the war began in April of 1861, troops came through, first from Pennsylvania, the following day from Massachusetts. They came through Baltimore on the way to Washington to answer Lincoln's call, and they were set upon by a mob. And there was loss of life, and Lincoln figured, well, if we can't get our troops down here to fight the war, then how are we going to have any chance of winning it? Thus, the declaration of martial law. And what did that mean? It just meant that as an emergency measure, you can arrest someone. There's no writ of habeas corpus. You don't have to bring that person into a court before a judge and tell exactly why he has been arrested. That has been suspended. And throughout the war, that same rule by executive action was in effect. By the time the Lincoln assassination came along 4 years later, almost to the day, there was no longer any question that they could do this, because in 1863, the Supreme Court, probably intending a slap at the president, had said, when one of these cases came up on appeal, they said, oh, we don't take appeals from those things. We only take appeals from real courts. But what that meant was anybody accused in one of these trials, military trials of civilians, whatever that tribunal decided was final unless the president said otherwise. You could go to the president for a pardon, but you could not go to the Supreme Court or any appellate court for any kind of legal relief. So there was no question on April 15th, 1865, as Abraham Lincoln had just died in Washington, There was no question the way this trial was going to go. It was going to become a military tribunal. And because it had happened, the assassination had happened exactly when it did, it was hugely controversial. Robert E. Lee had surrendered his troops, and that's not all of Confederate troops, but the troops under his command had been surrendered the previous week on April 9th. On April 13th, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, talking with General Grant, who had just come into Washington that day, had done this quick, sudden, decisive drawdown. Stop recruiting, stop buying supplies for the Army, stop the draft, all of that stuff immediately, and no longer require any pass to go to and from former Confederate territory. All right, that was the day before Lincoln was shot. Some people thought, okay, the next day we're not in martial law anymore, right? So why are we going to have a trial by military commission? And you'd be surprised who was dead set against it. For one, two of the officers who were appointed to that commission tried to get out of it, and with General Grant's help, they managed to do so. General Grant himself was incensed when he had been called as a witness in the trial. He couldn't figure out what on earth he had to contribute that would further the ends of justice. And he complained to Secretary Stanton that the testimony is being taken in secret. And that's nonsense. Shouldn't have happened. Stanton said, okay, let's open it up. Third day of the trial, it is now open, and the testimony will be published. There were 8 people put on trial, and just if you want to get your bearings geographically here, on the other side of the tennis courts, and to your left, if you're looking from over here, you'll see Grant Hall over there. The third floor of that was, at the time, the northeast corner of the old Washington Penitentiary. It was a federal penitentiary built in the 1820s, and during the war, somebody says, hey, you know what? Having all of those felons right next to the Washington Arsenal, which was down to the south over here, a military installation, maybe that's not such a great idea. So they shipped all of those people off to Albany, New York, and then they started to use the penitentiary mostly for storage. And that is the way it had been going for a while. After the war, 2 years after the war, 1867, they decided to tear down the penitentiary. And for whatever reason, they left that one little part of the building, the northeast corner, they left it standing, and they left the opposite end, it's a mirror image, the opposite end, that's the warden's quarters and the deputy warden's quarters. They were pretty much left alone. Eventually, warden's quarters was torn down to make way for this building and the one next to it. But they still had that building over there, and it underwent some amazing transformations over the years, and people up until the 1970s and 80s were still arguing that that's not even the right building, but it was. But anyway, all of these people had been taken out, and this was all absorbed into the Washington Arsenal during the war. And so it was a very secure place. It's out on a peninsula. It's already under military control. And so General John Hartranft was appointed to be basically the provost marshal in charge of the penitentiary. And he brought in a staff of fellow Pennsylvanians mostly, and they ran the place like a prison for this trial only. There were 8 people put on trial. The trial sort of had its first stirrings on May 8th, and then May 9th they came back, and some of the prisoners still didn't have counsel. Some probably weren't even sure that they were going to be put on trial. They were all kind of confused about it, but they were asked to plead. And naturally, somebody would say, oh, I'm not guilty. And as they started getting attorneys, there were, by the way, two reactions in the legal community. Not in a million years would I have anything to do with that. Or, yeah, let me at him. And when these defendants started getting attorneys, they realized, wait a minute, when you said not guilty, you know, you kind of are recognizing the authority of these people. So let's take that back and say, I'm not going to plead guilty or not guilty. I'm going to plead to the jurisdiction. I'm going to say that this isn't a real court and you have no right to even ask me whether I'm guilty or not. Well, that's kind of how it started off. One by one, these people started to get attorneys, and some of them ended up with some very powerful people. We had, for example, we had Mary Surratt, a woman who ran a boarding house. It's now the Walk and Roll restaurant over in Chinatown. She was accused of being the ringleader. She had a tavern out in Maryland. Booth went to her boarding house, picked up something, turned out to be field glasses, and took it out to her place in Maryland. Oh, excuse me. He dropped it off for her. She took it out to her place in Maryland. He picked him up that night after shooting Lincoln. They figured she's pulling all the strings and she's the ringleader, so they prosecuted her. She managed to get Reverdy Johnson, United States Senator, former Attorney General, very heavyweight person. But Johnson did something very odd. He was challenged immediately on some political question about the oath, and he stood up and said, look, he said, my oath that I took was good enough to make me a United States Senator, and that is the body that creates generals and officers like you. The point was well taken. They withdrew the objection to his appearance as counsel. And then he did something very odd. He said, I am not here to defend traitors. I am not here to tell anyone that I approve of what happened to President Lincoln. I abhor with all my heart and soul what happened to him. And I'm not defending rebels or anyone else. And I haven't even met this woman. I feel she deserves a fair trial, and I think I'm here to plead to the jurisdiction, and that's it. If I'm going to go talk to her, and basically, if I think she's guilty, I'm out of here. Can you imagine that? Especially when he really didn't show up much after that in the court. It kind of sends a signal. Anyway, so Mary Surratt, her other two attorneys were pretty weak. First time criminal trials, in fact. We had Lewis Powell. We'll hear more about Powell later. He tried to kill Secretary of State William Seward, botched the job terribly and horribly mutilated 5 people in the Seward house in Lafayette Square across from the White House. He got William E. Doster as his attorney. Doster had been the Provost Marshal of Washington earlier in the war. That was pretty good. Harvard and Yale educated man. And then we had Dr. Samuel Mudd, who was represented by Frederick Stone and by General Thomas Ewing, brother-in-law of General Sherman. Very highly placed man in his own right, and the first Chief Justice of the Kansas State Supreme Court. And Michael O'Laughlin was represented by Walter Smith Cox. Father was a very prominent man in Washington, former mayor of Georgetown, and Cox was a very able attorney and a teacher of law at Columbian College. And one by one, you can go through all of the different attorneys that these people managed to get, and you can see some really great talent. But they were all up against one thing that was going to sink their cases. And everybody said this, right? Oh, they're only here to convict. Everybody said it. It is a military commission, and the first thing that they do is they meet together in private, and they decide what their rules are. They didn't have to tell anybody what the rules are, but if something should come up, they say, no, that's against the rule. They did tell the attorneys, and the rules sounded very similar to what a civilian court would have observed at the time. Surprisingly similar, because the rules, by our standards today, are very, very strange. But by their standards, yeah, okay, that's not too bad. But there was one big thing, one really big thing that made all the difference in the world, and that is they don't have to reach a unanimous verdict. In fact, all they have to do, they've got 9 people on the commission, all they have to do is get 5 votes for guilt, and he's convicted. And they don't have a penalty phase. What they decided to do is, if the count is 2/3 for guilt, then it's the death penalty. So think about it. You get 4 votes for your guilt, you're acquitted. 5 votes, you're convicted. 6, they hang you. That was amazing. Well, what happened, essentially, was that in the course of the trial, they found that one of the prosecutors, John Bingham, later the principal author of the 14th Amendment, again, these are heavyweights on both sides, John Bingham had argued that the Confederacy was behind the assassination. And because each and every one of these defendants was a Confederate sympathizer, there's no need to go any farther than that. All Confederate sympathizers are equally guilty of this crime. I don't think he really expected to win the case on that alone, but he spent a good deal of his time trying, and throughout the time of the trial, he kept harping again on Jefferson Davis's administration, the Confederate government, and all of the different atrocities that they were being accused of. Poisoning the water that supplied the city of New York, burning down hotels in New York City, deliberately starving prisoners of war. All of this came in. And when the defense attorneys stood up to say, oh, wait a minute, and they say, excuse me, this isn't about your client. So all of those charges were unanswered. And everything that came out in the conspiracy trial about the Confederacy, about Jefferson Davis, about his government, about starvation of prisoners, and all of those things, all of that went unanswered because Jefferson Davis didn't have an attorney there. Henry Wirtz of Andersonville didn't have an attorney there. And 1/4 of the conspiracy trial was pretty much consumed in those issues that were essentially bring in witnesses to say these things and then let them go, and that's that. So these defendants have been told that because they were sympathizers, because they knew Booth, whatever it was that connected them, it's looking very bad for all of them simply because they can't answer these questions. Well, there were different circumstances in each case. Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Laughlin had conspired with Booth to capture Abraham Lincoln. Booth had convinced them that it was perfectly legal, and for the strangest of reasons, it was. They had sent out earlier in the war General Orders 100, in which it said that taking of hostages is regrettable but sometimes necessary. The federal government did it. So Booth told these people, hey, we capture him, you know, they can't do anything to us, really. We're prisoners of war, maybe, but... And the idea was to free up, to force the Lincoln government to resume an exchange of POWs. That's what he said. Now, 1864, that sounded, oh, okay. It's a very hot issue in 1864. It's an election year. It's what people keep saying, and all these pictures are coming out of all these POWs from Andersonville and places like that, they look like they're barely alive, and it becomes a very emotional issue. But in 1865, they get together and they say, what are we doing here? They have resumed the POW exchange. And Booth and Sam Arnold get into a fight. To them, that constituted breaking away from the conspiracy, and they said it is an entirely separate matter. So the strategy was, some of these people say, we were in a conspiracy but not to kill Lincoln. We were in a conspiracy that had nothing whatever to do with killing Lincoln. And that's why John Bingham, the prosecutor, said, no. It's all one thing. The burning of hotels, poisoning of water, starvation of prisoners, it's all the same conspiracy. Well, when they came down to it, from mid-May to the end of June, when they were taking all these witnesses one after another talking about all these things, they went into deliberation, and there was a good deal of argument back and forth. They ended up taking a second day just for one of them, Dr. Mudd, because they couldn't decide the first day. And ultimately, they decided by 2/3 or more that Lewis Powell, who had tried to kill Secretary Seward, Mary Surratt, the supposed ringleader, George Atzerodt, who was in it right up to the last minute, supposedly assigned to kill the vice president, but I don't think he ever intended to, and David Harold, who had been captured with Booth and had spent much of the time with Booth on his escape after the assassination. These are the people who were still there on April 14th, still involved with John Wilkes Booth one way or another. So I believe that the Military Commission did ultimately decide that there was a separate conspiracy and that it was somewhat of a lesser offense than the actual killing, because Dr. Samuel Mudd, Ned Spangler, Edmund Spangler, a stagehand at Ford's Theater who was accused of paving the way for Booth to escape and get out of the theater after shooting the president, Michael Kauffman, and Sam Arnold, those 4 people were found guilty of the same thing, essentially, but apparently by only 5 votes instead of 6 or more. And so they were given life in prison, or in the case of Spangler, 6 years of hard labor. 3 of those survived 4 years of that sentence. Michael O'Laughlin died in prison of yellow fever. There was an epidemic in Fort Jefferson, which is 70 miles west of Key West. You can't get any hotter. You can't get any more closer to hell on earth than Fort Jefferson, and that's where they were sent. It was a military post. And Michael Laughlin died there in '67, and the other 3 had been trying to convince President Andrew Johnson for years that the testimony was bogus, and Johnson finally decided, yes, you're right. One thing that John Wilkes Booth did, and one thing that was brought up in the conspiracy trial, Walter Cox, I think, put his finger on it all when he said, you're not convicting these people for what they did, but for what Booth did to them. And when you go back and look at all the testimony and all of the things that were piled in together, you can't help but notice that John Wilkes Booth was taking advantage of the law that existed in both military and civilian trials. The law that a person accused of a crime cannot testify in his own behalf. And when Booth pulled somebody aside and said, hey, let's go over here and let's do something, he's making sure that he has witnesses, and there are all these people around. And when, during the course of his conspiracy, people start to desert him, because let's face it, the idea of carrying Abraham Lincoln away, as a capture victim, really didn't seem all that sane to some of these people, and they tried to get out of the plot, and then Booth would tell them one by one, you're already in it. Remember this time that you and I were seen doing this? Remember this? Remember that? said, oh no, I can explain that. Not in court, you can't. And he was right. And ultimately, the biggest question, fairness, was that trial fair? No, it wasn't. But would it have been much different in a civilian trial? In one of the biggest ways, not really, because that same rule, what they called the rule of defendant declarations, that was still in effect in civilian trials as well. And that was the biggest weapon that these prosecutors had in the Lincoln conspiracy trial. Now, of course, they could take a vote and say, well, we don't think you should say this or that. And generally speaking, the commission did sustain the prosecution. That's true. And there probably was a good deal of bias involved. But that would have been true in any case. John Surratt, Mary Surratt's son, accused of being a part of the plot himself, he traveled all over the world on his escape. And someday I'm going to do a bus tour that takes everybody from Elmira, New York, to Montreal, to Liverpool, to London, to Paris, to Rome, to Malta, and then Alexandria, Egypt, where John Surratt was caught. Better pack some clothes. It's going to be more than a day for that one. But when he came back, he ended up with a civilian trial. And they ran into all the same biases, and guess what? It was a hung jury. They didn't get a conviction, but also they did not get an outright acquittal. So I'm not so sure that the military trial made quite as big a difference. But when the next case came along in just before World War II, the case of the Nazi saboteurs, there was no mention of this one at all. You want to know why? Because it turns out during the course of the trial, there were these little suspicions that some of this testimony about the Confederate government was cooked up. And right after the trial, a man was convicted and finally admitted that he had made the whole thing up. And that's why this turned out to be not a precedent to be used for Guantanamo, for the Nazi saboteurs, but it is still a very, very important site and a very important event in American legal history. Thank you. Well, now, I'd like to introduce, very great pleasure, to introduce a friend of mine, John Elliott, who will be the next speaker. John?